Emily stepped outside to find Daniel waiting near his car. His posture relaxed, but his eyes serious. And before she could ask anything, he said he had been thinking a lot about honesty and timing, about how some things appear when people are not ready yet refuse to disappear. And his words carried urgency, making Emily listen closely, because she felt the same pull and knew this conversation could change everything. They walked slowly along the quiet sidewalk instead of getting into the car right away. The city sounds distant and the air cool, and Daniel admitted that staying silent had become harder, not because of desire, but because of the growing importance of her presence in his life. And Emily felt her heart tighten as she responded with equal honesty, saying she had tried to ignore her feelings but failed. Not out of weakness, but because they felt real and steady. And in that shared truth, the careful balance they had maintained began to shift. Daniel paused and told her he did not want to rush or hide, that he had seen too many choices made in silence turn into regret. And Emily respected that. She had lived with regret before and knew how heavy it could become. And as they continued walking, she spoke about her past. About how she had learned to protect herself by keeping distance, and how this connection scared her not because it felt wrong, but because it felt meaningful. And Daniel listened without interrupting, giving her space to speak freely, which made her trust him even more. The conversation moved quickly yet deeply, covering fears, boundaries, and the reality of work. And they agreed that whatever happened would need to be handled with care, transparency, and patience, not secrecy or pressure. And this agreement did not lessen the emotion, but grounded it, making it stronger in a different way. When they finally reached the car, the mood was serious yet calm, and Daniel suggested they take a short drive. Not as an escape, but as a moment to breathe. And Emily agreed, feeling the need to clear her thoughts, and as they drove through quieter streets, the city lights passing like slow signals, they spoke less, letting the weight of their conversation settle. And in the silence, Emily realized how much trust had already formed. How safe she felt sharing space with him, and that realization surprised her more than anything else. The drive ended near a small park where Daniel pulled over and turned off the engine. And without drama or grand words, he told her that he cared for her deeply and that this was not a passing feeling. And Emily answered honestly, saying she felt the same but needed time to understand what it meant for her life. And Daniel accepted her answer without disappointment, which only deepened her respect. And in that moment, they both understood that the connection between them had reached a turning point, not a finish, but a clear edge where choices mattered. As Emily stepped out of the car, the air felt still, and she paused, looking back at him with a soft smile that carried gratitude and uncertainty. And Daniel returned the look, his expression calm yet full of hope, and as she walked away, Emily knew the distance between them was no longer just physical, but defined by patience and intention, and that whatever came next would require courage, because the feelings they shared were no longer quiet thoughts, but living truths, waiting for the right moment to move forward. The following morning at Harrison & Co. Emily felt a strange mix of anticipation and nervous energy as she walked through the familiar doors, noticing the usual hum of computers and the clatter of keyboards, but sensing something different in the air. And when she reached her desk, she saw Daniel already there, quietly talking to a colleague, yet glancing at her occasionally with a calm intensity that made her chest tighten. She reminded herself to stay professional, yet every interaction, no matter how small, carried weight. From shared smiles to brief exchanges about reports and meetings. And she realized that the simple presence of Daniel in the office had shifted her perception of the space itself, making it feel warmer, more alive, and slightly unpredictable, as if the routine she had relied on no longer applied. Later, when Robert Harrison gathered everyone for an unexpected meeting in the main conference room, Emily felt her heart skip when she noticed Daniel standing beside his father, not merely visiting but involved in the company's work, and Robert calmly explained that Daniel would be consulting for a temporary project over the next few months, assisting with client relations and team organization, and Emily's mind raced as she processed the implications, realizing that every future interaction would carry new layers of meaning and tension. Not because anything inappropriate was happening, but because proximity changes everything. And suddenly, the quiet moments they had shared in the car felt amplified, their conversations echoing in her mind. As the day moved on, Emily found herself observing Daniel more closely, noticing the small details that humanize someone we think we know, like the way he leaned slightly when listening, how he managed his tasks efficiently without appearing rushed, and the calm way he interacted with the team, which reminded her of the ride they had shared and how natural their conversation had felt. And she realized that the connection was no longer confined to fleeting rides or after hours. Chats but had expanded into the everyday flow of life, making her emotions more complicated yet somehow more grounded. During a quiet moment in the afternoon, Daniel approached her desk with a small notebook and a casual question about a client report. And while the topic was professional, the way he engaged, with gentle curiosity and patience, reminded Emily of their previous talks and the ease they had found in each other's company. And she realized that these brief interactions were now layered with meaning she couldn't ignore, not because anything was wrong, but because human connection grows quietly when given space to breathe. And that awareness brought both excitement and caution, a mixture she had never felt before. As the workday ended, Emily gathered her things while Daniel finished a phone call. And when he approached her afterward, he asked if she wanted to walk to her car together, explaining that he enjoyed the calm of the evening streets and that it gave them a chance to continue conversation in a less formal setting. And Emily agreed, feeling the same pull, the same desire to prolong the moments that made her feel seen and understood. And as they stepped into the crisp night air, the city lights reflecting on wet sidewalks, she noticed the way the world seemed quieter, more intimate, as if it had created a private space just for them. As they walked side by side, they spoke of future projects, of small personal ambitions, of books they had read and places they wanted to visit, and each word carried weight, not from urgency, but from sincerity, building a delicate bridge between professional boundaries and human connection. And Emily felt her heart respond in ways she hadn't anticipated, aware that the attraction she felt was not superficial but rooted in shared understanding and respect. When they reached her car, Daniel stopped and looked at her with a serious yet gentle expression, explaining that he valued their honesty and wanted to make sure she knew he respected her boundaries, her position and her choices, and Emily felt relief and warmth. Because his care was not just in words but in attention, thoughtfulness, and deliberate action, which made her trust him even more. She thanked him, admitting that she felt the same way. And in that exchange, the tension between desire and respect found a quiet equilibrium, a balance that made their connection feel safe yet charged with potential. And as she leaned against the car, she realized that the drive they had shared earlier, the conversations, and the moments of quiet understanding were no longer isolated experiences, but the foundation of something real and fragile, waiting to grow. Daniel smiled, a small, honest gesture that made her chest flutter, and Emily stepped inside her car, watching as he walked back to his own vehicle. And in that moment, she understood that the ride, the walk, the conversations were all part of a slow unfolding, a beginning without a clear ending, filled with hope and patience, and she allowed herself to feel it fully, to let the uncertainty exist alongside the warmth. 'Cause life sometimes offers moments that can't be rushed but must be experienced with attention. As the engine started and she drove into the city lights, Emily thought about how much had changed in such a short time, realizing that what happened at the end of that drive was not a conclusion but a quiet promise. A shared understanding that life could be complicated and boundaries could exist and still genuine connection could grow, and she smiled softly, feeling anticipation rather than fear, knowing that in the days and weeks ahead, every glance, every conversation, every shared moment would matter. and that the ride had opened a door to possibilities that neither of them could predict. But both were willing to explore carefully, leaving Emily with hope, curiosity, and a steady awareness that some encounters, even the simplest ones, have the power to transform ordinary life into something unforgettable. Emily Parker stood outside the glass office building as the evening lights flickered on one by one, her phone glowing in her hand with the same message she had already seen 3 times searching for driver. The day had been long, her feet ached, and the cold air slipped through her coat as cars passed without slowing. She had planned everything carefully that morning, including a quiet ride home with her husband, Daniel. But plans had become fragile things lately, easily broken by late meetings and unanswered calls. Daniel had texted an hour earlier saying he was stuck at work again, apologizing the way he always did, with words that sounded sincere but tired. Emily tried not to feel disappointed, but disappointment had become familiar, like background noise she no longer reacted to. She looked around at the nearly empty street, remembering how different life felt when waiting for someone meant excitement instead of silence. As she shifted her weight and considered canceling the ride to try another app, a dark gray car slowed beside her, smooth and quiet, not rushed like the others. The window rolled down, and a calm, confident voice said her name, catching her off guard enough to make her look up quickly. It was Richard Collins, Daniel's boss. Someone she recognized instantly, even though they had only spoken a few times at company events where she stood politely at Daniel's side, smiling while he talked about work. Richard looked composed as always, dressed neatly, his expression kind but thoughtful. And for a brief moment, Emily wondered if she had done something wrong just by standing there. He asked if she was waiting for a taxi, his tone casual, and she nodded, feeling suddenly aware of how tired she must look. He glanced down the quiet road, then back at her, and said that taxis had been slow lately, that traffic had been strange all evening, and then, without drama or pressure, he offered to give her a ride home since he was heading in the same direction. The words surprised her more than they should have, and she hesitated, her first instinct telling her to say no, to wait it out, to avoid anything that might feel uncomfortable or unnecessary. But the street was getting colder. Her phone buzzed with another delay, and she thought about how long it might be before she actually made it home. She also thought about Daniel, how he trusted Richard, how he spoke highly of him, and how this offer felt practical rather than personal. After a short pause that felt longer in her head than it really was, Emily thanked him and opened the door, settling into the passenger seat with a careful movement, as if she were stepping into a moment she didn't fully understand yet. The car smelled clean and faintly of coffee, and the soft sound of the engine filled the space between them as Richard pulled away from the curb. For a few seconds they drove in silence, the city lights reflecting off the windshield, and Emily felt a strange mix of relief and tension. Relieved to be moving again, but unsure why her heart felt more awake than it had all day. Richard broke the silence by saying he hoped she didn't feel awkward, explaining that he'd seen her before waiting alone and didn't want to leave her standing in the cold. And she appreciated how normal he made it sound, as if this were simply the kind thing to do rather than something unusual. She told him she was grateful, admitting it had been a long day, and he nodded, saying those days seemed to come more often than people expected once life settled into routine. His words were simple, but they felt thoughtful, and Emily found herself responding without overthinking, mentioning how work and schedules had taken over more than she ever planned. She wasn't complaining, not exactly, just speaking honestly. And Richard listened without interrupting, his attention on the road, but his presence steady. The car moved smoothly through familiar streets, passing places Emily knew well, yet the ride felt different from her usual ones, quieter but somehow fuller. She realized she hadn't had a calm conversation like this in a while, one that didn't feel rushed or distracted, and the awareness made her both comforted and uneasy. She adjusted her coat, reminding herself that this was just a ride, just a moment. But something about the timing, the unexpectedness, and the simple act of being noticed made it stand out. As they stopped at a red light, Richard mentioned Daniel briefly. saying he worked hard and carried a lot on his shoulders, and Emily agreed, feeling a familiar ache at the thought of how much Daniel gave to everyone else. The light turned green, the car moved forward, and Emily wondered why this ordinary ride felt like the start of a story she hadn't meant to step into, unaware that this moment, small and quiet as it seemed, would linger long after the car came to a stop. The car continued down the road, moving away from the bright office building and into quieter streets where shops were closing and houses glowed softly from inside. And Emily felt the tension in her shoulders slowly ease as the city noise faded behind them. The silence between her and Richard did not feel heavy, but it was full, like something waiting to be spoken. And the soft music playing on the radio filled the space just enough to make the moment feel calm instead of awkward. Richard kept his focus on the road, driving smoothly. And after a few minutes, he spoke again, saying he hoped her day hadn't been too exhausting and that long hours could slowly wear people down without them noticing. Emily answered honestly, saying work itself wasn't the problem, but everything around it felt rushed and unfinished, as if life was always happening one step ahead of her. She surprised herself by speaking so openly. Yet his quiet listening made it feel safe, and once she started, the words came easily, not dramatic or emotional, just real. She mentioned how Daniel had been under pressure for months, how she understood why he stayed late, but how evenings had started to feel lonely even when she tried to stay busy. And she laughed softly, admitting it felt strange to say these things out loud. Richard didn't react strongly or offer quick advice. He simply acknowledged her feelings, saying that distance often grows quietly. Not because of anger, but because people stopped sharing small moments. The road curved toward her neighborhood, streetlights passing at a steady rhythm, and Emily watched them slide by, feeling as though each one marked a thought she had ignored for too long. She asked Richard if work ever followed him home, and he answered with a thoughtful smile, explaining that leadership came with responsibility, but also with long nights of wondering if he had chosen the right path. And for the first time, she saw him not as Daniel's boss, but as a person who also carried doubts. The conversation picked up pace after that, moving naturally from work to life, from plans they once had to the way time reshapes expectations. And Emily felt a strange comfort in how easily the minutes passed. She realized she wasn't watching the clock, wasn't counting turns or traffic lights, and that awareness made her heart beat a little faster. Not with fear, but with recognition of something missing from her routine. Richard shared that he valued honesty more than success, that he believed people often stayed silent too long to protect others. And those words stayed with Emily because they reflected something she hadn't admitted even to herself. As the car slowed at another light, she noticed her reflection in the window, her face calmer than it had been earlier. And she wondered when she had last felt truly heard without needing to explain herself. The music shifted to a softer song, and the quiet moment allowed her thoughts to surface, reminding her of dinners eaten alone, messages sent late at night, and conversations postponed until tomorrow and without meaning to. She admitted that she sometimes felt invisible, not blamed or mistreated, just unseen. Richard responded gently, saying feeling unseen could be more painful than being argued with. And that acknowledgement made her chest tighten in a way she did not expect. The car turned onto her street, and Emily felt a sudden pull between wanting the ride to end and wanting the conversation to continue, aware that both feelings were equally strong and equally confusing. Houses passed slowly now, familiar and ordinary, and she recognized how different the inside of the car felt from the world waiting outside, as if this small space had allowed honesty to exist without judgment. Richard reduced speed, signaling toward her driveway, and the reality of the moment returned quickly, reminding Emily that this was just a ride, just a conversation. Yet it carried a weight she would not easily forget. As the car rolled to a gentle stop in front of her home, the engine idling softly, she felt a quiet shift inside her. Not a decision or a promise, but an awareness that something important had been stirred. She thanked Richard sincerely, her voice steady, and he replied with the same calm respect he had shown from the start. saying he was glad he could help and that conversations like this were rare but meaningful. Emily opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air, pausing for a moment before closing it, and as she stood on the sidewalk watching the car pull away, she realized that the ride had given her more than a way home. It had given her a clear reflection of the space in her life that needed attention, and that realization stayed with her as the taillights disappeared down the street. Emily closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, letting the quiet of the house wash over her while the distant hum of the street faded into the night. The ride with Richard had left her feeling unexpectedly stirred. Not in any romantic or inappropriate way, but with a sharp awareness of her own needs and the space she had been neglecting in her marriage. She walked slowly toward the living room where Daniel's absence was palpable, the empty sofa and the ticking clock reminding her that life had continued without pause while she had been waiting for moments of connection that rarely came. Sitting down, she wrapped herself in a blanket and thought about the conversation, how it had flowed naturally, how she had spoken honestly without fear, and how Richard had listened with attention and respect that felt rare and necessary. Her mind raced over everything she had said, the confessions she had shared about feeling invisible, overlooked, and exhausted from carrying the weight of responsibility both at home and in her work life. And she realized that for the first time in months, she had allowed herself to be fully seen without judgment. The honesty she had spoken aloud lingered with her as she considered Daniel's role in her life. The man she loved who worked tirelessly, who provided and protected, but who had unknowingly drifted into a routine that left emotional gaps. Emily understood she had a choice, to let the quiet frustration grow into resentment or to face it with courage and speak openly. When Daniel finally returned, quiet and tired as usual, Emily felt the familiar mix of affection and ache that always accompanied his late evenings. She waited for a moment before speaking, choosing her words carefully, and said, simply but firmly, "I miss you. Even when you're here, I feel like we're not together." Daniel froze, his eyes searching hers, surprise and concern flashing across his face as he realized how far her feelings had strayed into silence. He admitted that he hadn't noticed, that he thought everything was fine because no complaints had been voiced. And that acknowledgement hit Emily with both relief and sadness. Relief because the truth was finally out. Sadness because it had taken so long to surface. They talked for hours that night, slowly, patiently, navigating the space between them with honesty and openness, uncovering emotions neither had expressed before. And Emily realized that communication itself could feel like intimacy, stronger and more sustaining than any fleeting excitement. Days passed and Emily noticed small changes in herself and in her interactions with Daniel. Subtle but meaningful moments where they shared laughter, small stories from their days, and even silence that no longer felt empty but comfortable. At the next company event, Emily saw Richard across the room, and their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the conversation they had shared. Nothing more, just respect and understanding. And it reminded her that the night's ride had been less about him and more about her own clarity and boundaries. She understood now that the impact of that ride was to reflect her feelings back at her, to show her what she had been missing in her life without suggesting she needed anyone else. And the realization made her feel strong, grounded, and capable of change. Walking home from that event later, hand in hand with Daniel, who had made time to leave work early, Emily felt a sense of presence she hadn't experienced in years, a feeling that small but intentional actions could rebuild connection and trust, and that she did not have to wait for extraordinary moments to feel valued. Every conversation, every laugh, every shared silence now carried weight, because she had opened herself to honest expression and had been met with willingness to understand rather than judgment. She reflected on the ride and the evening, realizing it was a turning point, not for romance or temptation, but for self-awareness and emotional courage, a reminder that acknowledging one's feelings and voicing them could transform ordinary routines into meaningful experiences. The memory of Richard's calm, careful listening remained in her mind as a benchmark for communication, something she could bring into her relationship with Daniel. showing him what it felt like to be fully understood without blame or expectation. Emily knew she could not change the past, nor could she control every late night or missed conversation, but she could change her approach, ensuring that the moments she shared with Daniel were intentional, present, and emotionally rich. In the weeks that followed, she noticed a rhythm returning, a sense of partnership that had been missing. Not perfect or dramatic, but steady and real. And she carried the quiet pride of knowing she had faced her feelings instead of hiding them. Every evening when Daniel returned, she greeted him with honesty and warmth, expressing appreciation for what he did and sharing small pieces of her day. And gradually, the quiet gaps between them closed, replaced by a growing trust that they could navigate life together without losing themselves. Emily realized that sometimes the most unexpected encounters do not lead to new paths with other people, but to a clearer vision of one's own needs and desires, a deeper understanding of what it means to love and be loved fully and sincerely. That night, as she and Daniel sat together sharing a quiet dinner, she felt the weight of the past months lift slightly, knowing that the reflection she had received on that short ride was a gift, one that had shown her how to reclaim herself and rebuild the connection that mattered most. The experience had been brief, unexpected, and yet transformative, not through romance or temptation, but through honest recognition and emotional clarity. And Emily carried that awareness forward, determined to nurture her relationship while never losing sight of her own voice. By facing her emotions directly and embracing the courage to speak, she had turned a single, ordinary ride into a moment that reshaped her perspective, reminding her that love, attention, and understanding begin with openness and honesty, and that even small, unexpected events can spark profound change in a person's life.